Okay, we're going to start now, if that's all right. We've given the stragglers time to struggle. So, my name is Tim Lang, and I'm Professor of Food Policy at City University here in London, where I head up a Centre for Food Policy. I've been asked to chair this. I'm going to introduce our panel, then I'm going to just say a few words before they then speak. On my right, your left, Rosie Boycott, who's head of London Food, standing in for Mike Duckett of the Royal Brompton, who is unfortunately ill, seriously ill, being rushed into hospital, but he's okay apparently, is Jackie Schneider. So a gender change here. Jackie very kindly from Merton Parents, a sort of good activist and teacher on public policy. Extreme left over here, your right, Kath Dalmini from Sustain, who is all things to all people. And hastily, Chris Horridge from Cliveden House, which is where the bourgeoisie cavorted and caused scandals endlessly for 60 years. And they still do. So we'll hear all of this in the name of public institutional food later. Okay, just to sort of tease you into what the topic is here. What we're meeting to talk about is, the title, in case you've come to the wrong meeting, in which case go gently now, is feeding people in public institutions. This is a very interesting and extremely unsexy topic over the last 10, 15, 20 years. But it's a topic and an issue which is coming back into mainstream public policy and commercial policy. It's an issue which used to be at the forefront of trying to think through where food went. So it's returning, it's not new. In the 1980s, public food essentially went off the agenda because the political ethos was privatization. School meals were privatized, hospital meals were privatized, even prison food was privatized. But in the 1990s, on the back of public health evidence, some beginnings of concern about social inequalities, public food began to creep back onto the agenda, not least due to the work of Sustain, as it was then called the National Food Alliance, which Kath is here representing, and long-term campaigning about issues like school meals, that Jackie will talk about, no doubt. And in the 2000s, reforms of public food came onto serious mainstream political agenda. There was a resuscitation of school meals standards, which had been abolished in 1980. Sections 22 and 23 of the School Meals of the Education Act in 1980 abolished nutrition standards that had been put in place in 1944 by a conservative Minister of Education and had been reinforced by all party governments ever since. So in the 2000s, we've got it coming back on the agenda in a big way. The 2010s, most of us think, and I suspect all of us here think, it's going to be about mixing public health agenda, sustainability, and international issues of equity and trade and availability, issues like food security. So there's a fast evolving agenda. If you think of that in 4 decades, the agenda has shifted dramatically. So this is an extremely timely meeting. What's at stake? I think we think it's about money. £2 billion of our taxpayers' money is spent on public food. It's the credit crunch. Finances are being squeezed. Trillions of money is being thrown at bankers. Without any doubt, there's going to be pressure on the public purse to reduce public institutions, and public food might be squeezed by that. There are some issues of practicalities and skills. Rosie's been wonderful on this, pushing it in London, trying to get new projects celebrating skills. It's a cultural issue that I'm sure Chris will talk about. You can produce wonderful food in a hospital or in a hotel or a school, but if people won't eat it, what do you do? There's the politics of it. Are governments going to support? What are the political parties' different positions on it? But I think above all, it's an issue where we would all, I think, agree, and I suspect most of you, but who knows, it's up to you. There's going to be an issue about change, how to manage the change, how to get everyone to move. There's a friend of mine from Cumbria, or what used to be the Lake District, says you can't sort things out unless everyone's on the same mat. Are we all on the same mat on public food? So that's what we're going to be debating about. I hope that sort of got us all onto roughly the same mat, but I'm very happy if others want to say different things. So we know what we're doing first with Rosie.
Hi, can you hear me? Thank you. I mean, the first thing I'd like to say about public food is that about 6 years ago when I broke my leg, I spent a lot of time in hospital, and the one thing that I found absolutely essential to take with me was a jar of tomato ketchup, so that I could smother every single meal in the stuff in order to get it down my throat, because quite frankly it was both pretty unpalatable and extremely unhealthy, and almost no vegetables or fresh salads or fresh fruit were served. But it is encouraging, and in the short time I've been chair of the London Food Board, I mean, I've been seeing a lot of initiatives, and as Tim says, I think we are all slowly getting onto the same map, and the government has woken up to the need that public institutions, almost over and above everything, because they are the most massive consumers of food, have to do something about their offering if we're not going to have the runaway obesity and diabetes and ill health and what happens to kids in schools in terms of ADT, which I'm sure Jackie will talk about. And we've all seen the magical effect that feeding people decent food can have on them, and especially can have on young children. What in the London Food Board we've been doing is that, first of all, we have to say, well, you've got to get good food into the right places where the public institutions can buy it. So we do a lot of work with the markets, with reconfiguring them, and then with building hubs around London so that the smaller producers can get access with fresh, locally sourced, seasonal food that is really healthy and get it into the capital. So we work with smaller groups, we work with the transport so that we have low emissions and electric vehicles bringing it in. And this is something that I'm hoping over the next 3 years we will rapidly expand, and that if I could wave my wand and have a vision, I'd have a food hub every 40 miles around the M25 roughly, so that there'd be a continuous supply coming into the markets. As the Food Board, we've also funded people in all the main markets so that they're there to help the smaller producer who's giving us really local and seasonal and good food. But of course, there's no point in having the good food again unless you also provide some level of training. That's not just because food waste is massive, and what that comes down to is bad catering, buying too much, buying the wrong thing, and ending up in landfill. And as we all know, food contributes a massive 40% to our emissions, our CO2 emissions in this country. So it's one area where we can really, really work towards mitigating climate changes by changing our weird and strange and cumbersome food system. One of the projects we've been particularly behind is something called School Food in Greenwich, run by Claire Pritchard. And Claire does a wonderful thing of creating gardens in schools where the kids cook, and then they bring their parents in to cook with them. But more than that, she's trained now over 1,000 public sector chefs in how to produce good food at a reasonable price, because people go on about saying, well, there's the credit crunch and the government are going to cut down on food. The reality is we can't afford to cut down the bills on good food, because we get the bills coming back at us later in terms of extra healthcare and all the things that go wrong with kids when they have a bad diet. So we have to do it, but also it doesn't have to cost the earth if you know what you're doing and you know how to cook. And you realise that you can get just as much out of pulses and lentils as without having to necessarily supply processed meat, which we all eat too much of anyway. So I think that we have to see this as part of a cultural thing. I mean, I was glad that Tim said the word public procurement is extremely unsexy. Unfortunately, it is. On the whole, people are much more interested in hearing about events like today and farmers markets and sort of new types of cheese than they are about hearing, well, how do we supply our hospitals and our schools? But actually, that's really where the big cultural shifts have to happen, because when they can happen at that point, then they will genuinely ripple out across the whole country. So that's my bit. I'm going to pass you over to Jackie for that.